If you're a fan of the Indianapolis 500, then there's a good chance you know who won the first race back in 1911. It was Ray Harroun behind the wheel of a Marmon Wasp, the only driver in the field to opt against using a riding mechanic and running solo, albeit with a little help from a relief driver. But what if I told you that might not be true? What if I told you that we don't actually know, with 100% certainty, who won the inaugural Indy 500? Today on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're going to continue our discussion from last week concerning the founding of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the chaotic first races held at the track in its first 3 years of existence. This week, it's all about the inaugural Indy 500 and about trying to track down who it was that really won the first edition of the greatest spectacle in racing. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. When we last left the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, it was perhaps on a sour note. During the track's first automobile race weekend in August of 1909, 7 people had died, including drivers, riding mechanics, spectators, and folks who were unfortunately killed either heading to or leaving the track. Somehow, circuit founder Carl G. Fisher had escaped legal repercussions, but he was forced to shut down the speedway for some much-needed maintenance and repairs. But by the end of 1909, the track's doors were opened back up. That was all thanks to a man named Will P. Blair, who had a much better idea for the speedway's track surface than its original lasagna-like layers of gravel and toroid. See, Fisher knew that his original plan for the track surface, no matter how audacious, simply wasn't working. His vision of gleaming white stones being packed into a smooth, high-speed circuit was not only extremely expensive, but it had turned out to be ridiculous when put in practice. He and Ernest A. Moross, the speedway's publicity man, started to consider some other surface options, including concrete, wood, and something called bitumineral, which was said to be a cement-like substance. Enter Will P. Blair, secretary of the National Paving Brick Manufacturers Association. Blair was the kind of man who could sell his wares to even the most unsuspecting and unlikely customers, and Carl G. Fisher was one such man. In Blood and Smoke by Charles Learson, the author states that Blair's selling argument has been lost to time, but that it may have had something to do with the fact that bricks have a tendency of staying where you put them compared to layers of stones. Whatever the case, he did convince Fisher to pave about 200 yards of the speedway's front stretch with these bricks, and if Fisher was satisfied, he would buy a whopping 3.2 million of them at a cost of $180,000, which is around $6 million today. The disastrous Wheeler-Shebler race weekend came to a premature end on August 21st. By September 11th, the front stretch had received enough bricks that national driver Johnny Aitken was tasked with running a slew of tests to see if the bricks were actually all they were cracked up to be. In addition to gunning up and down the front stretch, he also tethered his car to some posts and gunned the engine to see if his spinning tires would cause damage. The bricks didn't budge. 6 days later, laborers were on site to lay down some sand to serve as a bed for the rest of the bricks. With the new surface being laid, Fisher and Moross started drafting up grand plans. On October 14th and 15th, they announced that there would be an aeronautical show, so they sketched up some airplane hangars for the event. On November 1st, they decided that there should be some automotive time trials. Oh, and why not approach the National Amateur Athletic Union about hosting the 1912 Olympics? And start a car company named Empire Automobiles. And you know what? This is as good a time as any for Fisher to marry his girlfriend Jane and take her on a honeymoon out west. All the while, bricklayers were sweating away at the speedway, trying to battle against the onset of winter. It should go without saying that Fisher had severely underestimated, once again, how long it would take to pave a 2.5-mile track in bricks, so all of those autumn events had to be canceled. But progress continued apace. On December 7th, Governor Thomas R. Marshall was invited to lay a bronze brick at the finish line to celebrate the end of construction, and a few races were scheduled for Saturday, December 18th. Considering that most of the schedule was composed of time trials and that it was a whole 9 degrees Fahrenheit, few folks bothered to turn up. If you're a non-American, 9 degrees Fahrenheit is around negative 12 degrees Celsius. Barely 500 people turned up for day one, with around 150 coming for the second day of action, despite it being both a little warmer and free to attend. Rather than let it get to him, Carl Fisher was undeterred. 1910 was fast approaching, and he decided that it would be a far better year for the Speedway. In May, a 3-day race meet took place on the track with a few wrecks but no fatalities. Ernest de Moras, the publicity man, stepped back from his role at this time, which meant that 2 weeks later during an aviation show, there was no one to fudge the numbers of the crowd to the press. Another race meet took place in July, with C.E. Short taking on Moras's role. That whole year, poor attendance plagued the Speedway, and Fisher decided to cancel the 24-hour race he'd scheduled at the track in August and to shorten his Labor Day racing program from 3 to 2 days. Fisher was miffed. The fascination with automobile racing clearly hadn't died away because there were countless other successful races all across the country. They just didn't take place in Indianapolis. Plenty of daredevil drivers like Barney Oldfield were keeping motorsport alive and well, while a four-wheeled showdown between boxer Jack Johnson and racer Oldfield, a showdown between a black man and a white man, provided plenty of fodder for the press. But over at the Speedway, fans were nowhere to be found. Fisher and his co-founders had sunk an extra $200,000 into building more grandstands, expecting fans to turn up in droves, but they didn't. Fisher, too, had started looking elsewhere for more exciting business opportunities. Bill Muir, a longtime friend of Fisher's, said, "I don't think he was ever interested in money as a particular goal. Carl would just pull a deal out of the air. He could combine things that would stagger the average person. And I think he was just interested in the excitement of having these ideas and accomplishing them." After a trip to Miami, which at the time was sparsely settled yet ripe for potential, Fisher became obsessed with the idea of transforming the 5,000-odd population into a booming metropolis. But he was willing to give his Speedway one last big crack before he'd call it a failure. All summer long, Fisher and his co-founders James Allison, Frank Wheeler, and Arthur Newby brainstormed various ideas to turn their racetrack into the world-class destination they believed it would be. As they dreamed and schemed, one particular idea kept popping up. Those multi-day race meets diffused the excitement through a variety of short races before getting to the main event, and it wasn't easy to promote all of those minor events. Having a handful of those meets per year also didn't help with the whole generating excitement thing. If you missed one, you could just turn up to the next one. So what if they scrapped all those minor events and all of those different race weekends? What if, instead, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway consolidated its racing schedule into one single massive event, the likes of which no one had ever attempted before? Wouldn't that make things a little more exciting? There was only one way to find out. It didn't take long before Carl G. Fisher had found an answer to his problem. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway's marquee annual event would be a 1,000-mile race, or maybe a 24-hour race. Those were both big round numbers that flew in the face of the American Automobile Association's belief that 100 miles was about the maximum for any race. 100? Why not go for 1,000? According to Sarah Allison, wife of Indianapolis Motor Speedway co-founder James Allison, it was her husband who held Carl Fisher's hand and explained, "Let's give people something they can see start to finish in a reasonable amount of time." 500 miles. 500 miles was a good, healthy distance, and it would still be a length that few organizers had ever attempted before. On September 7th, 1910, Speedway officials issued a press release that read, "Officials of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway today announced plans for the automobile race to be run on May 27, 1911, in which American cars will be pitted against the best of Europe for a purse of $25,000. The contest, as announced, will be for 500 miles, and it is to be known as the Indianapolis Motor Speedway 500-Mile International Sweepstakes." The date would soon be moved from May 27th to May 30th, which was known as Decorum Day, the original name for Memorial Day. The reasoning there was that plenty of folks still worked on Saturdays, but the Decorum Day festivities would give people a brief respite from work. If IMS wanted to get as many people into the track as possible, it would be smart to host its annual sweepstakes on a day that people were free to attend. It was an audacious idea, but as far as locals were concerned, it was just another one of Carl Fisher's crazy schemes. The announcement also came at a brief moment of anxiety for the industry, where a slight dip in auto sales was construed as meaning the whole thing was just a passing fad, one that should be obvious when you looked up the meager ticket sales for big races. Now, clearly that mindset didn't last long, but it was just enough for plenty of locals to pass off the idea of a 500-mile sweepstakes when it was initially announced. And as 1911 got underway, studies showed that, yes, actually, people were still buying automobiles in droves. Preparing for the event, Fisher and Company threw out their previous playbook and asked hard questions about how to make this event really work. The initial problem was the fact that after a few laps, fans would have no way to understand what cars were ahead, who was a lap down, how a pit stop had impacted a race, and so much more. A few years before, Fisher had gotten involved with the Warner Horograph Company, which had created a timing system. A complex and primitive one, yes, but still a way for fans and officials to keep tabs on what was happening. In key Carl Fisher style, he never actually bothered to get that timing system installed, but with several months before the big 500-miler, he had plenty of time to get the system figured out. Another winning factor was that there were only 2 limits on the kind of cars that could enter. Each car had to be at least 2,300 pounds, and it could have a maximum engine displacement of 600 cubic inches. The $25,000 prize purse, also a big deal. While that wouldn't even be $1 million today when adjusted for inflation, the simple fact was that sport in that era really wasn't a big money affair. Aside from a select few boxers, most athletes were paid a tiny sum if they were paid at all. Most folks were expected to compete for cups, trophies, and prestige, so the fact that there was a financial windfall coming to both the winner and 9 other highly placed competitors of this 500-mile sweepstakes was huge. For all the hemming and hawing about the future of auto racing, the big prize purse meant that the first entry form hit Carl Fisher's desk on October 2nd, which included the $500 entry fee. That entry belonged to the J.I. Case Threshing Machine Company of Racine, Washington, who nominated Louis Strang to serve as their driver. Entries were accepted up until May 1st, which just so happened to be the day that the track opened for practice. A total of 46 cars entered, and 44 turned up to the event, but the only cars that took advantage of the early practice sessions were locally based teams that didn't have to travel very far to make it to the speedway. The first cross-country flight would take place in 1911, and there was no such thing as a car transporter, so many of the drivers that entered the event had to make a cross-country trek behind the wheel of their race car. That in and of itself was a struggle, since there were no formal, well-maintained cross-country highways. Most of the faraway competitors would turn up shortly before the race. The entry list was a who's who of early racing talent. Ray Harroun, Ralph De Palma, Howdy Wilcox, Johnny Aitken, Arthur Chevrolet, and Fred Ellis. Most of the starters were American, some of them foreign-born but later made American citizens, with only 2 men racing under a different flag. One was W.H. Turner, a Canadian who moved to Buffalo, and Huey Hughes, who was born in London but moved to America in his 20s. There was a bit more diversity in the makes of the cars entered in the race. Italy was represented by Fiat, Germany by Mercedes and Benz. 13 of the 40 starters were from Indiana, with most of the rest of the field hailing from other parts of the Midwest and East. One of the more powerful automakers turned team owners, though, was Howard Marmon. Howard Carpenter Marmon, born on May 24, 1876, saw the early appeal of the motor car and knew there was a fortune to be made. Marmon had taken over the Nordyke Marmon & Company brand, which manufactured flour mills, and in 1902 he and his brother built their very own luxury automobile. After all, they had plenty of money and access to their fair share of industrial equipment necessary for building those mills. The Marmon brothers' shared automotive passion would lead them to eventually set aside the milling machinery business entirely and turn wholly to building cars. But in the early days before World War II, Howard Marmon was more of a wealthy benefactor to the racing scene than he was anything else. He became close friends with Carl Fisher and was keen to get his cars on racetracks all across the country. He used his influence and wealth to become a key player in defining the early motorsport scene. As preparations ensued at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, teams and drivers were also making preparations, particularly regarding relief drivers. Howard Marmon, a member of the AAA's Rule Committee, had used his sway to convince the organization to alter its 100-mile maximum drive time rule, so that just before the inaugural Indianapolis 500, drivers would be allowed to compete for 7 straight hours before they would be required to pull into the pits and swap drivers. The assumption was that the Indy 500 would not last 7 hours, a very convenient fact, but there were still a handful of folks who wanted to err on the side of caution and make sure that they had a capable second driver at hand. And Howard Marmon had also hired one of the best drivers of the era, a man named Ray Harroun. By all accounts, Harroun was not the kind of man you would have expected to build a reputation in the racing scene. He was quiet, mild, and fairly risk-averse. The kind of guy who quickly found success driving for automakers like Buick and Marmon, but who was keen to get out of the racing game as quickly as possible. As Charles Learson says of him in Blood and Smoke, Harroun was the kind of guy who would rather get home for dinner than die. Unfortunately for him, he was a damn good racer. Harroun was born in Spartanburg, Pennsylvania in 1879, and he got his first taste of the outside world serving on a ship in the Spanish-American War, his first taste of automobiles when he moved to Chicago to serve as a chauffeur to William C. Thorne in 1902. That job didn't last long because the moment Harroun got behind the wheel, or as was more likely the case back in 1902, the tiller, he knew he was good. Within months, Harroun quit his job and joined the legion of average Joes designing and building their own cars. He got a job test driving and selling cars for Buick, then earned his way into the driver's seat in big races by putting in time as a riding mechanic. Then, in 1909, a slot as the driver opened up in Howard Marmon's racing program, and Ray Harroun took the job. There was an asterisk to that acceptance. Harroun had a tendency to claim that each year would be his last, and soon after, he'd retire for good. In fact, he'd already done so when Marmon asked him to gear up for one final race, the 1911 Indy 500. Harroun would be a clear favorite for that inaugural Indy 500 race win, but there was a certain amount of concern about his entry, namely the Marmon Wasp that he'd been tasked with driving. Yes, he had taken victory in the machine during the Wheeler-Shebler event the year prior, but the issue with the Wasp was the fact that it was a single-seater. Remember, this is an era when racing machines were two-seaters, primarily so that the second seat could be filled by a riding mechanic. The riding mechanic was tasked with operating all manner of pumps and dials to keep the car running in peak form, and he was also expected to serve as a kind of rearward lookout, letting the driver know when someone might be flying up to pass him. The other drivers hated this idea. The way they saw it, the Wasp carried an inherent weight advantage to go along with its sleek, streamlined shape. Plus, they argued, it would be dangerous for a man to compete without having someone to keep an eye on things behind him. Drivers threatened to boycott the event. Legend has it that Harroun went back to his garage and worked up an ingenious little solution that we now know today is a rearview mirror. Allegedly, the story goes, the first of its kind. The concept of a backwards-facing mirror had existed in the auto industry for a few years at that point, but it wasn't until Harroun mounted one on the race car that many historians credit it as coming to fruition. Whether it was the first rearview mirror or not, it was enough to satiate the grumbling competition. Harroun was allowed to race the Wasp, and no one boycotted. As race day approached, even more drama kicked off, this time tracing back to former IMS publicity head Ernest A. Moross. Moross had gotten into the business of driver management and promotion, and he was now serving as the personal manager of Wild Bob Berman. Berman had traveled to the Speedway with an absolutely massive Blitzen Benz whose engine was over twice the displacement allowed in the event. But Moross had an idea. See, he'd proposed to Carl Fisher that Berman take his Benz out for a series of time trials on the morning of May 30th, just before the start of the Indy 500. And despite learning that no one in the grandstands enjoyed watching these time trials, Fisher agreed. Plenty of the entrants for the first Indy 500 had already made appearances at the Speedway, so they were well aware of the fact that these time trials were just about the farthest thing from interesting. but they also grew annoyed at the fact that Fisher had proposed such a smart idea, limiting the racing program to just one big event, and now seemed fully prepared to just go back on his word. Many of the drivers were also mostly annoyed at the fact that Moras and Berman were going to get what amounted to free publicity, which is never a good thing for your rivals. Fisher let tensions simmer until 2 days before the race, when he announced that Berman would be making his trials the following day, May 29th, one day before the 500-mile sweepstakes. An early morning rainstorm turned the brick-covered speedway into a slick mess, and Berman even blew the right front tire of his Benz coming to the line. But when he crossed that line, he learned that he'd broken records for the half mile, the kilometer, and the mile, all while driving the exact car at the exact track that had earned Barney Oldfield those records previously. It was a cause for celebration, but it probably should have been a sign that something was off with the Warner horograph system. I didn't say the first sign, because the Speedway had already had its first sign several days previously during qualifying. At that time, qualifying was mainly just designed to prove that each car could average 75 miles per hour over a quarter mile, and therefore certify that it had the pace to compete. Most of the cars in the field had already demonstrated that speed during practice, but there were still a few that needed testing. The cars that either hadn't practiced or hadn't met speed were given 3 attempts to average 75 miles per hour, and if they weren't able to, they weren't allowed in the big show. Of the 44 entries, 40 cars were certified as able to meet speed. From there, they were ordered on the grid based on when they submitted their race entry. If all the drivers had had their laps timed, why weren't they lined up in order of the fastest to slowest speed? Was it because that practice simply hadn't been adopted yet? Perhaps. But considering the fact that the Indianapolis Motor Speedway officials adamantly refused to distribute any speeds or lap times at any point in practice or qualifying, it certainly seemed a little strange. Almost as if this timing system wasn't up to snuff. Here, I think we need a moment to dig into the Warner horograph system. What did it look like? How did it work? Well, first and foremost, no one seemed particularly confident on any front regarding it. According to Charles Learson in Blood and Smoke, the device looked like a sewing machine attached by wire to a vintage Victrola. Its whole purpose was not only to time automobile races, but to keep an accurate running order of the cars from start to finish. But how exactly did it work? Well, this massively complex machine is a little complex even for me to try to sum up and describe, so I'm going to pull some paragraphs from Blood and Smoke to do it justice. To the elements employed by earlier timing companies, miles of wire, rolls of paper, inky ribbon, springs, automated hammers, telephones, and human links in the chain of supposedly flawless mechanical communication, Warner had added typewriter components, dictaphones, bells, and no, not whistles, but marbles, hundreds and hundreds of them that would be dropped into tubes to keep account of each car's laps. The one element his horograph did not borrow from its predecessors was the stopwatch itself, rigged up in some newfangled way. Instead, Warner put in his sewing machine box, and at the heart of the system, 4 roller skate-sized wheels, suggestive, Moras wrote, of those used in the familiar recording telegraph or news ticker. Warner's wheels were embossed with numbers and capable of stamping on paper a time he claimed would be accurate down to the 100th of a second. An ever-unspooling strip of paper, as well as typewriter ribbon, rested along the tops of the ever-moving wheels that at any given moment might rip the paper to shreds. When a race driver passed over one of the 2 electrical wires that was stretched a few inches above the surface of the track, one at the start line and the other a mile further on, the current was interrupted and a hammer actuated by an electromagnet thwacked down hard across the ribbons, pressing them into the wheels and recording a time. Warner said he could record each entrance pass over the wire as long as one car was at least 6 inches behind another. When a race was in progress, especially a 40-car race like the inaugural Indianapolis 500, the hammer would thwack away madly and all sorts of slightly askew timestamps would be produced. But which jittery row of numbers belonged to which car? This is where humans came in. The system required at least one main spotter for each car, with a backup man strongly suggested for longer races. As the drivers whizzed by, the spotter assigned to say number 27 would call out 27 when his man hit the wire. The head timer would then write this down on his scoring sheet, keeping an ear cocked for the exact order in which the cars were being shouted. Of course, in a 40-car field such as competed in the 1911 Indy 500, several spotters were likely to be shouting at once, making the timer's job more than tricky. But no problem. 3 or 4 Columbia dictaphones, each operated by a team of certified recording specialists, were on hand to pick up the shouts, the theory being that these could be played back and sorted later in case of confusion. Then, with the numbers and positions noted, runners would head off to a series of scoreboards around the track to update the running order for fans. Simple, right? With 200 timing judges and a whole host of spotters, runners, technicians, and backup spotters and runners and technicians, how could any of this go wrong? And did I mention that this Warner horograph system hadn't been tested yet? Like, at all? And that the folks invited to operate this machine were just a bunch of so-called distinguished men in Indianapolis that Carl Fisher was hoping to impress? As in, folks who were learning how the system worked on the fly? Maybe that should have been a cause for concern. Maybe fans and journalists should have pushed a little harder for the exact times from qualifying or the exact details from Wild Bob Berman's record-setting run. But no one knew that they needed to be concerned, and if they were, well, it was far too late to make any changes to this complex system. Heading into race day morning, as Carl Fisher was probably hoping for headline-making chaos, his army of timing and scoring personnel were probably hoping for a calm, relaxed race. One that would lend itself to an easily identifiable winner. We just gotta get into race day. May 30th, 1911. 40 cars had qualified for the inaugural International 500-mile sweepstakes race held at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and they lined up on the grid 5 cars to a row, with the exception of the first and last rows. Up front, taking the place we would normally expect to be held by the pole sitter, Carl Fisher was leading the field to the start in a Stoddard-Dayton pace car, for the first recorded rolling start for a field of that size. The crowd of 80,000 who paid $1 for entry to pack into the grandstands, though, likely didn't understand that they were witnessing such a pivotal moment in motorsport history. As the field rolled around the track, a red flag flew, which at the time signaled the fact that the track was clear. Carl Fisher increased speed as he guided the field up the front stretch, then dipped down into the pit lane, which at the time wasn't so much its own separate lane as it was an unimpeded extension of the front stretch, where crews were expected to work under the threat of oncoming traffic. Amid a cacophony of pure noise and smoke belching from the engines, the Indy 500 had begun. Perhaps drawing on his ample experience at the track, national driver Johnny Aitken rocketed into the lead from 4th on the grid, which at the time was the very top end of the first row. 5 laps later, Aitken was hoovered up by Spencer Wishart driving a customized and costly Mercedes, but he was forced to forfeit his lead soon after thanks to a bad tire. That left the lead to Fred Belcher, a young working-class driver behind the wheel of an ox. Within the first 30 miles of the event, Belcher found himself ready to lap the tail of the field by nearly crashing into the rear of a smoking Fiat driven by David Bruce Brown. At least, we think Belcher was leading. Some accounts report Bruce Brown as being in the lead of the field here, because as you might imagine, the Warner horograph timing system had already proved a handful. One of the timing tripwires had already snapped, and the runners manually reordering the field on one of the track's 4 scoreboards were not in agreement about what driver was in what position. The field, though, was about to face a dramatic reset. On lap 12, the number 44 Amplex lost its right front tire. The wooden wheel crashed onto the bricks and forced the high-speed car into a mad swerve the driver Arthur Greiner tried desperately to correct. Somehow he ended up avoiding any other cars, but when the Amplex hit the infield grass, it began to flip end over end until suddenly it came to rest with its nose buried in the dirt and its rear end pointing up to the sky. Greiner was thrown from the car and sustained a broken arm, But the same couldn't be said for his 24-year-old riding mechanic Sam Dixon. Where the driver was thrown out almost immediately, Dixon held on for a while longer, teetering in that upended car until it finally came crashing down into the grass, top first, killing Dixon. At least, that's what we think happened. The reports of the accident vary, either saying that Dixon was crushed, or that he was thrown into a fence, or that some other horror had befallen him. The how of the crash was less important for many than the insistence that they describe Dixon's mangled body in gruesome detail. Yet again, spectators flocked to the body, forcing state militia, who were serving as event security, to club spectators out of the way to make room for doctors. According to Charles Learson in Blood and Smoke, by this point very few spectators were actually paying attention to the action because frankly they had no idea what was going on. After about 30 miles, when tires started to blow and pit stops started kicking off and drivers started getting lapped, keeping track of the action was something of a losing game. Again, remember, this is a time when pit stops could take up to 15 minutes, and no one was actually timing these stops, so no one really knew where the cars were filtering back into the action when they got onto the track. But those stops were apparently long enough that Louis Strang had time to get out of his car and play with a stray kitten in the pits while his machine was being serviced. By that point, most of the spectators had vacated their seats in order to use the bathroom or to buy some snacks, and the more astute journalists on site had come to the realization that the folks in charge of timing the event had no clue what they were doing. A report of the event in Motor Age magazine claimed that there were too many cars on track and no one could follow the race. The event was robbed of that great interest that is ever present when everyone knows at all times exactly how the different cars are running. The race did not tire the drivers perhaps as much as expected, but it did tire thousands of spectators. Most of the riders on site, though, were just content to accept what Speedway officials were telling them was happening. Ralph De Palma was said to take the lead around mile 60, a lead that he held until Bruce Brown overtook him. Apparently it was Bruce Brown who hit the 100-mile mark first, and he proceeded to lead for quite some time after that, but no one is sure by how much. Trying to understand what happened is frankly a little chaotic. At one point, California driver Teddy Tetzlaff blew a tire and crashed into Louis Disbrow, which resulted in Tetzlaff's riding mechanic David Lewis fracturing his pelvis. But if you try to cross-reference newspaper reports with the official revised results from the Speedway, you'll find that the writers were claiming this happened somewhere between mile 125 and 160, while the revised results list Disbrow dropping out of the race after 112.5 miles, while Tetzlaff apparently retired with mechanical problems after just 50 miles. I know I'm really harping on this point, but the timing and scoring fiasco is the defining feature of the first Indy 500. As a historian, you know you're not always going to have some of your primary sources in agreement on every single detail, but there's usually some consensus about how things transpired. But not for this race. Honestly, sometimes it feels like everyone who wrote about it or recorded the event experienced something entirely different. Part of that comes from the fact that it was nearly impossible to watch what was going on without any help from Speedway officials, and part of it likely involves the fact that automobile racing was such a new concept that there was no unofficial understanding of what was going on. Today, most people recognize the concept of the Indy 500 thanks to its longevity, but in this first edition, no one really knew what to expect. At the very least, we do know that Marmon Wasp driver Ray Harroun was likely the first person to pit for a relief driver. He'd brought with him Cyrus Patchke, and around the 150-mile mark, Harroun pitted to take a breather. Some sources say that Patchke was the first driver to meet the 200-mile marker, though others naturally have differing opinions. Patchke spent 35 laps at the wheel before he brought the Wasp back into Harroun and went to relieve driver Joe Dawson, another member of the Marmon camp. That would be the extent of his 15 minutes of fame, because in the aftermath, Patchke has largely been written out of the history books. If you listened to the DPTJ episode on riding mechanics last year, you'll know that those mechanicians went largely ignored in newspapers and post-race reports. Relief drivers suffered a similar fate. Around mile 240, the driver of the number 8 case, Joe Jägersberger, discovered that he had no control over the steering of his car. He bounced off the wall lining the outside of the track, which pointed his car back into the infield. At some point, and for some unknown reason, his riding mechanic Charles Anderson left the vehicle, got trapped beneath it, and was run over. According to various newspaper reports, Anderson wasn't dead, but he was able to sit up on the track just in time to see the Westcott of Harry Knight bearing down at him at full speed. Rather than crush the unsuspecting fellow on the track, Knight veered toward the pit lane where he crashed into Herb Little's Apperson and took out both drivers. All the while, Jägersberger's case looked to be on a collision course with the stand that was housing timing officials. And, desperate to avoid being collected in an incident, all of those officials fled the stand. Now, thankfully, the case did not crash into them. It had just gotten a little too close for comfort. But it did mean that for 10 minutes, the race raged on, and no one was there to officially score the action. The halfway point of the race came and went without anyone shouting into their dictaphones, tallying things up on their adding machines, popping marbles into chutes, or sending runners out to alter the order on the scoreboards around the track. A few contemporary accounts credit the number 32 Marmon Wasp with leading the race, but those reports aren't sure if it was Harroun or Patchke behind the wheel, and there are also reports that say David Bruce Brown was leading. Who knows? From the halfway point to about mile 400, things seemed to calm down. The number 33 Lozier of Ralph Mulf began to mount a challenge for the lead, but in a quiet way, so as to preserve his machinery. The men who had taken that route were the ones who made it to mile 400. By contrast, many of the fellas who had pushed like hell at the start were discovering the hard way that their early automobiles were not capable of taking that kind of a beating, and more cars retired from the event. It was only around mile 400 that the front runners really started to pick up the pace, with some drivers running so hard they were a regular feature in the pit lane, in dire need of new tires. The spectators remaining at the track began to find their seats in the grandstand, keen to see how this whole thing would play out. Did they know that the scoreboards they were intently studying had been abandoned for 10 minutes halfway through the race? Did they know that the timing and scoring system as a whole was something of a disaster through and through? Did they know that the timing lines had been snapped by wear and tear of those early automobiles hitting them again and again for 500 miles? We don't know. But we do know that after the race, Lozier team manager Charles Amis claimed that Speedway officials assured him his number 33, driven by Ralph Milford, was leading. History hasn't recorded exactly how he was assured of that, but it does sound as if officials pointed to one of the 4 scoreboards dotting the track, one that posted Milford in the lead, and claimed that this was the most accurate scoreboard in the whole place. With 20 miles to go, Charles Amis didn't want to risk blowing up his car from the lead, so he signaled Milford to slow down, to not overtax the car. Lozier crew members say that Milford was the driver who first saw the flag, indicating that there was only 1 lap remaining in the race. Behind him was David Bruce Brown in second and Ray Harroun in third. Bruce Brown and Harroun soon swapped positions as the former's Fiat picked up some spark plug issues. Lozier crew members also say that Milford was the driver to cross the timing line first, but that just to be sure that there was no tomfoolery or miscalculation of the race miles, he ran an extra insurance lap or 2, just to guarantee that his race was complete and that his win was assured. Lozier crew members also say that by the time Milford made his way to Victory Circle, he found Ray Harroun standing there with the trophy instead. What happened? The inaugural Indianapolis 500 started after just 10 a.m. on May 30th, 1911, and came to an end 7 hours later at 5:37 p.m. After accepting $14,250 in prize money, over $450,000 today, Ray Harroun was escorted to a victory banquet, his name etched in the history books as the first winner of the iconic 500-mile sweepstakes. But was that an honor he actually learned? It was certainly a little early because the results of the race weren't actually officially formalized yet. In fact, car owner Howard Marmon allegedly haunted the Indianapolis Motor Speedway that night, confident that his Wasp had won, but wholly unsure what the poorly kept records might say. Multiple drivers and car owners had called for a recount right from the moment the race ended. According to Charles Learson in Blood and Smoke, there were instant concerns that a driver had not been credited for running the laps that they knew they had, which forced Carl Fisher's friend and AAA referee A.R. Partington to take the timing sheets and dictaphones off to a hotel suite where they would spend the rest of the night piecing together what happened. This is when Speedway and AAA officials realized that they had, to put it simply, screwed up. As they listened to the dictaphone tapes, they discovered a critical issue. Let's say that on the playback, they heard something like 24/7. Did that mean 3 cars, number 20, number 4, and number 7 had all passed by? Or did it mean that just 2 cars had gone, number 24 and number 7? Again, records of all the laps weren't available because there was a period where timing officials weren't in the timing stand. And so when you were reviewing the rest of the information, you had no idea if what you had there was correct or not. At around 3 a.m. on May 31st, Partington told the journalists assembled and waiting for their decision that it would be quite some time before anyone had any answers, but that no matter what, Ray Harroun and his Marmon Wasp was going to be declared the winner. Looking back, it's almost incredible to think that this could happen. Yes, a lot of drivers who finished lower down the field were annoyed that they weren't properly scored, but the primary purpose of reviewing the results was thought to be understanding the winner. Harroun had been so close to David Bruce Brown and Ralph Mulford that Partington had initially held off awarding Harroun a trophy in the event that he'd have to take it back. Now, after several hours of reflection, he'd concluded that Ray Harroun was the rightful winner no matter what. Why? Edward Towers, riding mechanic of the number 12 Amplex driven by W.H. Turner, later said, "Oh yes, sir, there was some hometown scoring," regarding the decision to crown Harroun winner. If you remember our chat about Howard Marmon earlier, then you will also remember he was an Indiana boy who had brought his successful Marmon Motor Company to Indianapolis. You'll also remember that Marmon had a lot of sway in the AAA and that he was a good friend of Carl Fisher's. If Partington wanted to keep his job and stay in everyone's good graces, well, he'd do well to avoid upsetting some of the most powerful men in the local automotive community. After all, it's not like fans at home or even other drivers would be able to review all the timing data. They just had to accept what the officials told them. Oh, and when the official revised results were published on the morning of June 1st, it just so happened that the other Marmon driver in the field, Joe Dawson, saw his finish elevated from a DNF to a 5th place. Why didn't the other drivers throw a fit? Well, second-placed Ralph Mulford was described as the most modest of drivers, the kind of guy who didn't smoke or drink, who sang in his local church choir, and who would talk to his cars as if they were a beloved pet. Apparently, he'd even go so far as to walk away from a particularly difficult car so as to not speak too sharply to his engine. Ralph Mulford wasn't the kind of guy who was going to raise hell about the result. He was happy to have made it the full distance without a relief driver and to come home with $5,000. Quietly, among family, and to his dying day, he maintained that he won the 1911 International 500-mile sweepstakes. But why hasn't anyone gone back and parsed those records today? Carl Fisher thought of that, and he had a solution. He instructed Partington to destroy every single piece of recorded evidence from the race before the AAA announced the revised results. Every dictaphone recording, every scoring sheet, and even the random notes that a judge might have made in the heat of a race. All of it gone. Timing official Harry Nepper said that if anyone got their hands on the timing sheets, it would do nothing more than prove the whole Warner horograph system was horribly inconsistent and almost impossible to keep up to date during a race. AAA Chairman Sam Butler concluded, mechanical devices for scoring should be avoided at major contests. They can break down and at best are only as good as the operator. Meanwhile, Partington defended the decision to destroy the records by saying that it would be unfair to such as the Apperson, which was withdrawn through no fault of their own. It was a terrible and perplexing explanation for the unforgivable destruction of those inaugural Indy 500 records. Of course, there was no way Carl Fisher could know that his race would capture the imagination of motorsport fans around the world so fully that in 2025, over a century later, the event would still be taking place. In fact, Fisher would have no idea that his race and his speedway would become the most hotly contested event in American racing, to the point that entire series were willing to fracture and die just for a shot at maintaining ownership of that event. Fisher himself died in 1939 at the age of 65 from a stomach hemorrhage. He had invested his fortune into building tourism centers in Miami Beach and various highways, and then lost that fortune thanks to the 1926 hurricane and the 1929 stock market crash. But for a while, his race just kept getting bigger. In 1912, it was determined the race would be run again, this time with a doubled prize purse, mandatory riding mechanics, and a revised timing and scoring system. Despite some pauses for war and pandemics, the race has continued well past anything Fisher could have imagined. The grand historic nature of the Indy 500, its ability to transcend anything the world throws at it, has given it an almost transcendental status. If you've been to the race, you know it doesn't feel like any other race. Not really. When you walk through the gates of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, you know you're about to witness history. You're carrying on a legacy that started generations before you were born. You're becoming part of the tradition, the pomp and the circumstance, and you're going to help construct the myth of that race for future generations. That's something you're just not going to get at any other event, except for maybe the 24 Hours of Le Mans or the Monaco Grand Prix. I think all of that magic is what makes the 1911 Indy 500 so infuriating. If there's one thing we human beings love, it's a good creation myth. A perfect encapsulated moment that creates a noble base on which to build. But the inaugural Indy 500 was not noble. It was messy and, frankly, embarrassing. I don't know if Carl Fisher was necessarily thinking about this race lasting into the 2020s, but I do think he was conscious of the fact that if he wanted to sell tickets for a second running in 1912, he couldn't let people believe he'd screwed up so royally that there wasn't just doubt about who won the race, but that there was almost conspiracy around it in order to preserve his own and the Speedway's reputations. The problem is that this denies us the ability to truly know what happened on May 30th, 1911. Fisher destroyed the foundational records from that day because he knew the damage it would do to his reputation. In exchange, over 110 years later, we have to reckon with the fact that we just won't ever know. And so today, when someone asks us who won the first Indy 500, we have to say it was Ray Harroun and his Marmon Wasp. The full story is almost too absurd to give anyone a satisfying answer to that question. Carl G. Fisher didn't give us any other choice. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next one, we're going to dig into the exceptional life of Camille Dugast, known as one of the richest and most accomplished widows in France, and who is one of the first women to ever compete in a motor race. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, don't forget to check out the DPTJ Substack. If you have further questions, sponsorship opportunities, or you just want to reach out, I have an email for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each episode. You can also find the full list down in the description. Once again this week, my main source was Blood and Smoke, A True Tale of Mystery, Mayhem, and the Birth of the Indy 500 by Charles Learson. If you have not bought a copy of this yet, you're really missing out. It's packed full of facts, but it's also written in a way that you are absolutely desperate to find out what happens next. I have a handful of other sources listed in the description, so you can check those out if you'd like more information as well. That's all from me today. I'll see you for the next episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys.